Yeah, I'm excited about this opportunity to talk to everybody. This is a talk that I enjoy giving, and it's really kind of a dive into this, the thoughts about the problems with ornamental invasives and some of the reasons behind them. And I, uh, I, I hope to not. I know there's a lot of experts here, and I know a lot of people that are on are probably very well versed in invasive species. But I do want to just make sure that we're all on the same page. So I'm going to start this webinar with some basics, just talking about invasive species, why we're worried about them, and then get into the introductions, how they showed up, how invasive species got here, and then really kind of get into the meat of the webinar after that and really talk about this ornamental pathway of introduction. You know, what are some traits of ornamental plants that tend to make them bad invaders? Why are invasive species still being used? And then talk about some, highlight a few of the ornamental invaders that we're seeing as problems. And then what can we do about it as, you know, natural resource managers, and also what can we do about it as landowners and just citizens. Alrighty, so just jumping right in then, uh, you know, invasive species are a problem, regardless of what habitat you work in, what area of the country, area of the continent you work in. We all deal with invasive species if you're dealing with natural resources. This is a picture here of an open area that was planted into trees, and all the kind of gray-green color you can see there is all autumn olive, which is a problematic invasive here in Illinois. And this tree planting basically completely failed due to just being overtaken by autumn olive. And so these are some of the problems with invasives. You know, these big monocultures like you see here with Amur honeysuckle just make management and dealing with them very difficult and costly. And even many times we're dealing not just with one invasive plant, but we have multiple ones kind of ganging up on us here, as shown at this picture here. And so it becomes a complex issue of managing these things. And once they arrive on the landscape, they're hard to eradicate, they're hard to manage, and they're hard to get out of there once they're well established. And then just a shot of some of the Illinois invasive species that we deal with. Again, any habitat, whether you're in wetland habitat, full aquatic habitat, prairie, forest systems, urban systems, you've got different invasive species that you have to deal with. And so invasives, again, most people know this stuff, but just starting kind of at the basics, I like to always give kind of the formal definition of what an invasive species is. You hear that term used a lot, invasive, and sometimes it's used correctly, but a lot of times they throw that term around for plants or organisms that it doesn't really qualify for. And so I like to give this definition, and I consider an invasive species, it's one that's not native to that ecosystem. It didn't naturally evolve there or migrate on its own. It's not a normal part of that ecosystem. It has escaped, naturalized out, and it's formed its own free living populations. And then really those free living populations, there has to be some kind of negative consequence for them now being into this ecosystem. There's some kind of damage or disruption that's as a result of them on the landscape now. And we call that damage ecological, economic, or environmental damage, but there's something that is negative, something impactful to the system, and that's why it becomes an invasive. There's plenty of example of plants that are not native, that have escaped and naturalized, but don't take that next step and become really a damaging component. And so it has to do that to really be an invasive. And then when we're just looking at plants, these invasive plants, really, they become invasive, they become impactful because they're either faster or more efficient at acquiring, the limited resources that all these plants need to live, whether it's water, sunlight, nutrients, or space. These invasives are very efficient at getting these, very efficient at acquiring them, and kind of outcompeting the native plants for these limited resources, and then ultimately winning out. Here in Illinois, some of the ways we see our invasive species kind of doing this and becoming an invasive and winning out, if you will. Things like high seed production. This is a shot of Japanese chaff flower, a really problematic invasive in southern Illinois. And we're seeing that there's thousands of seeds per square meter of this plant. It just overwhelms seed banks. Other invaders simply have longer growing seasons. And with this, again, with Amur honeysuckle here, it tends to green up 2.5 to 3 weeks earlier than most of our native shrubs, and it stays green 3 to 4 weeks longer than our native shrubs. So every year it almost has 2 months more photosynthetic time than our natives. And so that just, again, gives it that competitive edge. And lets it acquire those systems, acquire the light it needs, and lets it grow and outcompete our natives. Others simply modify the habitat. This course is kudzu. If you're not familiar with it, just go to the southern US and you'll see plenty of it. We do actually have it here in Illinois. And kudzu itself as a vine is not very shade tolerant, so it cannot handle a lot of shade. And so by growing up over the trees, killing the trees, it's basically getting rid of the shade, modifying the habitat to suit its preferences. Others simply grow early or reproduce early. This is a shot of garlic mustard. Garlic mustard is one of the first invasive plants really to get going in the spring. It's flowering right now in southern Illinois. So it really competes with a lot of the early spring wildflowers and the things that need that high light environment. So by kind of getting that early phenology, it allows it to get a foothold. And then others simply, have allelopathy, and we're finding more and more plants that have this allelopathic properties, and everybody knows, black walnut is a classic native, that you can't plant certain things under black walnut because it gives off chemicals out of its roots. A lot of plants do this, and what we're seeing is, as we investigate this, a lot of invasive plants end up having some level of allelopathy, just to kind of help them have this competitive edge. And so invasives, these are a big issue. Again, kind of universally now recognized as a priority issue for natural resource management. In the US, the Forest Service considers it one of the 4 major threats, right up there with climate change and habitat loss. In Illinois, we have our Illinois Wildlife Action Plan, which is our plan to deal with rare and declining wildlife, and we consider it one of the 6 primary challenges to managing wildlife in Illinois. And I'm sure every state or every province that you can go to has similar things, similar plans that state the same thing. Again, it's a problem pretty much across the board. Everywhere you go, we're all recognizing invasive species as one of the major issues to deal with in conservation. Just a couple others kind of impacts and the ways that we have to deal with these plants. And again, this is garlic mustard, just as an example. It does have that allelopathic property, and we're finding that it can exude chemicals out of its roots that basically act like a fungicide and keep the mycorrhizae fungi in the soil from growing. So garlic mustard is one of the plants that doesn't really need that association with the fungi in the soil. So by keeping that down, it gives it its own competitive edge. Another big issue we have in Illinois and across most of the East is Japanese stiltgrass. There's some interesting research that shows that it really reduces diversity, and there was some long-term plots that they had on the ground. Stiltgrass moved into those plots, and then within 3 or 4 years after showing up first, half the species dropped out of those plots on average. So again, some major challenges. And then even with exotic shrubs, which I'll talk quite a bit about when I get into the ornamental side of things, there's some really interesting research out there showing that the rates of nest predation are really different in exotic shrubs versus native shrubs. In a lot of places, it's hard for even birds to successfully nest, as well as this early leaf phenology that I talked about with bush honeysuckle. It captures that high light environment in the spring that a lot of our reptiles need when they first emerge after hibernation to warm up. They come out of hibernation, they need to sun themselves and bask themselves to get that internal temperature up. And then normally they would come out at a time when there's high light environment, the leaves aren't out on our natives, but they come out and the leaves are already out on some of these invasives. It just really changes their ability to utilize that ecosystem, so much so that many times they just have to move out of there. They can't survive and they can't handle that lack of light in the early spring. And then more and more now we're seeing that ticks and tick-borne diseases are really tied closely to some of these exotic shrubs as well. So there's a lot of negative issues. But again, not all these exotic plants are invasive, right? And so any plant that becomes introduced, and we'll talk about that when we get into the ornamentals, has to kind of go through some steps and has to make its way to becoming invasive. And these kind of act as filters in the sense that not all species or not all plants can make it from introduction to escape and make it from escaping to naturalizing and then becoming invasive. So we all as managers, I'm sure we get the question a lot of time about exotic species and you know, how many become invasive, and definitely not all of them. It's really only a small proportion. And there's a thing out there kind of called the TENS rule. And that really just kind of says that based upon looking back at what's happened, looking back at literature, it kind of holds true that roughly 10% of species are able to pass through each of those transitional phases from introduction all the way to, you know, ultimately becoming invasive. So what that means is if you start with 1,000 species, roughly 10% or so, or 100, are able to escape, and then 10% of those are able to naturalize, and 10% of those end up becoming invasive. So roughly, when you look at the species that have been introduced, only about 1 out of every 1,000 ends up becoming very invasive. The vast majority of species that are introduced are never even escape, right? They're house plants or they're seeds that show up and are unable to live here. So it's just a tiny amount of them that become invasive. And the big problem is the ones that do become invasive are very problematic. And then lastly, the kind of last thing that they need to become invasive in an area is a climate match. And so another question that I get a lot is why is a lot of our invasives, why do they start with a name like Japanese stiltgrass or Japanese honeysuckle? And for the eastern US, you know, it's largely because that's a similar climate that we have. That's why we have Eastern Asian, Japanese, and European plants here that are problematic invaders, because those areas of the world are basically oak hickory forest, very similar to what we have here, and the climate and soils, the other plants are a match. So a species that evolved in those areas, very similar areas, are more likely to do well in our areas, and that's just another way. But just jumping in then, that's just kind of some of the basics. But really what I wanted to focus on is this idea of plant introductions and why they're introduced. And, you know, these are, again, with invasives, they're not species that evolved here. They didn't migrate on their own. There was some barrier of habitat that prevented them from getting here on their own. And so really the way that invasive species get to a site or introduced to a site are really human aided. So we move them, we are able to kind of overcome those barriers of inhospitable habitat, and some are introduced accidentally, and some are introduced intentionally. But both ways, you know, it's human aided introduction is why, you know, they show up in the first place. And there's a lot of reasons out there. If you look at some of the accidental plant introductions, some may be material contaminants in seed or plants, you know, hitchhiking in dirt, seed contaminants, just weed seeds in you know, seed mixes, things like that. Ballast water for aquatics, packing material. That's a great example for an invasive insect, emerald ash borer, which is a major one of our invaders. You know, came over and we think was first showed up in the U.S. as dunnage or wood crates. It was just a hitchhiker kind of in that packing material. And then Japanese stiltgrass is a good plant example that we think hitchhiked that way. So there's a bunch of these kind of accidental, we didn't want these plants here, we didn't intend them to show up, but they did. But the one that's more interesting and more on topic for today is this idea of intentional introductions. Plants that we brought over, introduced intentionally for a bunch of different reasons, and we put them on the landscape. And I think it's important to talk about these and kind of why we introduced them in the first place. But just a few of the reasons, a lot of plants are introduced for erosion control. Crown vetch is a good example of that. Agriculture introduced a lot of plants for wildlife. And then the big one we're going to talk a lot about today is ornamental. Ornamental plants is a major avenue of intentional introduction. Before I get into this idea of ornamental plants, I do want to make sure that I don't want to come across as bashing the ornamental or horticultural industry, because that's not at all what I want to do. I want to make sure um, to highlight that, and the fact that it's an important industry, it's a vital industry, it's a great industry, but it has brought some invasives. But also, just kind of going on that theme, us as natural resource managers, we're responsible for quite a few of these as well. And I think we need to make sure that we don't hide from that fact, and that we embrace the fact that we've made mistakes in the past. We've brought over species that have ended up being some of our worst invaders. And one of the ways we do that, and I like collecting these little booklets from time to time, and I find these, and these are from the 50s. And they highlight some of what I would call the mistakes in natural resources or agriculture with some of these invasives. And so the one on the left, of course, there is multiflora rose, and it's promoting it for living fences and for wildlife cover. Of course, multiflora rose didn't stay in that fence row, and it kind of grew out into the pastures and caused a problem. And one of the interesting things I found the other day, kind of looking up information for this talk, was multiflora rose in some areas were actually planted in the middle of highway medians, kind of in the grass median, as a crash barrier in some places. And I just think that's a horrible idea personally, because I couldn't imagine if I had a wreck in a car, and then that's bad enough, but you wreck in a car and land in a bunch of multiflora rose. It just seems like a horrible place to land. But a funny use for it. But autumn olive, highly promoted for wildlife and other uses. Many natural resource agencies, both state and federal, planted this thing and promoted landowners, gave it away to landowners. I do think it's funny that autumn olive, this booklet, the wildlife it highlights for autumn olive is also the exotic ringneck pheasant. I think that's funny. But others, Russian olive, Sericea lespedeza, there's a bunch out there of things that we've intentionally introduced, not understanding the kind of consequences, or not even at that time understanding that these were invasives. We kind of thought they had a good positive qualities, which they did have some, and that they would kind of enrich our area and provide those benefits without without understanding the negative consequences to them. Kind of the most interesting one, just going off on this line, is kudzu, right? We all know it kind of showed up a while ago. People called it porch vine. It was really promoted heavily for a while, and I did some kind of online research about this before this talk, and found kind of how it was promoted, where it was promoted, and things like that. And I found in 1937 there was actually a newspaper that was so enthralled with kudzu that they sent out a contest for odes to kudzu. They wanted people to write how good kudzu is, and write a piece kind of promoting it, and they had a contest for this. And the winner, actually, or one of the winners, was labeled as, they called themselves the Countess of Kudzu. And so the Countess of Kudzu wrote this short little poem about how all the benefits of kudzu. And I like it, so I'm going to read it to you guys. And it says, in our section of the woods, you save your soil and soul with kudzu. No one suffers from the floods who gives a little time to kudzu, nor gash nor goalie ere denudes who covers up his land with kudzu. And so again, we made a lot of mistakes. Kudzu was one of those where it was planted across the whole eastern U.S., and we thought it was the best thing for holding our soil, feeding our cattle, and then putting on our arbors and as ornamental plant. And so that's a good transition kind of out of the natural resource reasons and into this idea of ornamental plants. And that's really what I wanted to spend the rest of the talk on here, is this idea of invasive ornamentals. And I think there's no denying that this is a major pathway, both of introduction of new species, but also spread of species kind of across the landscape. And it's one that is growing. It's a big issue, and if you look at the numbers, and this is from 2010 here, the numbers of new cultivars, horticultural cultivars offered, is only increasing, getting more and more out there, and so we're getting new species and new cultivars kind of constantly coming in, and there's always a risk of some of those being invasive. And if you look at, and I kind of put this together, and I thought it was interesting. If you look at the traits of what you might consider a good ornamental plant and compare them to the traits of what you might consider some of the worst invaders, there's a lot of commonalities to these. You know, for instance, a good ornamental, something you like is you want a plant that's hardy and easy to grow. A bad invasive is a habitat generalist. It grows anywhere. A good ornamental is carefree. It doesn't require any attention. A bad invasive outcompetes other plants. It takes care of itself. Good ornamentals are ones that may be easy to propagate. Bad invasives spread, so they are able to reproduce very easily. So you can start to see these commonalities. A good ornamental may be one that has showy, abundant flowers. Bad invasives may have abundant seeds. We like ornamentals that tend to attract birds. Many of our invasive plants, in particular our woody invasive shrubs and trees, have bird dispersed seeds. And then finally, we definitely want good ornamentals that are pest and disease resistant. Bad invasives are typically not affected by our native pests and diseases. And so it's not surprising to see that some of the traits that we like in a plant as being a good ornamental, in some ways tend to select them also to have the potential to be some of our worst invaders. And so it's no surprise then that many of our bad invaders kind of started out as ornamental plants. And there was some recent research out there from 2017 that kind of looked at different invasive plants and different naturalized plants across the world, and then their point of origin, or their reason, for origin, and they wanted to find out what percentage of these naturalized and invasive plants kind of started out through that horticultural pathway. And if you see here, North America, both for naturalized and invasives, it's right around 60% of our plants kind of came through at least some level of the horticultural pathway, which is pretty alarming. I actually didn't think it was going to be that high. If you drill down a little further and only look at our woody invasive plants, some research from the early 2000s found that it's even higher. So for woody invasive plants in North America, it's actually over 80% of those started out as horticultural plants. And then those some other reasons as well. But that's a pretty high percentage of our woody invasives kind of came in on this pathway. And so, you can see some of these out there, right? So mimosa is a very popular, has been historically a very popular ornamental plant, ornamental tree kind of throughout the Mid-South and farther into the Southeast. But it's also a major invader, shown here kind of spreading out from the forest into this open area. This is a shot of a really, really sad looking amber honeysuckle that somebody decided to use as an ornamental plant. I have no idea why. That is seriously ugly. But it was first introduced as an ornamental species and sold, and it has a lot of beautiful traits. Not this one in particular, but when it's taken care of. But it's also probably the worst invasive plant we have in the whole entire Midwest, just devastating to our ecosystems. A little more recently, we're finding miscanthus, zebra grass, whatever you want to call it, is a super common ornamental grass. Ornamental grasses seem to be very popular right now, but it's also really, really moving through some areas, and we're finding it spread throughout kind of open forest and really a fast mover. Another one is princess tree. So princess tree, this is a shot of one for sale. It's called Royal Empress tree here, but it's the same thing, Paulownia. And it's advertised here as the fastest growing tree in the world. And that should definitely be a red flag for anybody looking to buy something online. This is a shot from Southern Illinois, and all that purple out there is Paulownia that is spread from ornamental plantings and is moving into some of our bluff habitats, which is where our some of our rare plants really reside. And then just a couple more. This is a shot of teasel. And teasel heads, as you may know, are really popular as dried flower arrangements. So you can buy little clusters of teasel heads, around. Um, but of course, teasel then is also really, really a devastating kind of open land invasive and really moving through a lot of roadsides and prairies and other areas. And kind of the last one that I'll highlight is just examples of these invasive ornamentals is giant hogweed. And if you don't know giant hogweed, it is a 15-foot tall carrot plant that has sap that can blister you, burn you, and cause blindness. That just doesn't sound like a great ornamental to me, but it actually was introduced as an ornamental and used around. People liked it. I guess they wanted something that was a little bit different. And so this begs the question then, these are all examples of invasive species that started out as ornamentals, and we can keep going all day with examples. But there's still ones right now. People are still planting a lot of these. And so this is a question that I thought a lot about is why are people still planting invasive plants? Why are landowners making that decision to buy an invasive plant and put it in their yard? And so after thinking about that, I kind of came up with, I think there's really three different reasons, three different explanations of these actions, or why invasive plants are used as ornamentals. And I think the first, probably is the most common one. I really think it's a lack of knowledge. I think that a lot of landowners simply don't know what they're planting, and the species they choose to plant as ornamentals are invasive. They've never heard that. They don't know they're invasive at all. So I think it's a lack of knowledge is a big one. It could be that that just us in general don't know that that species is going to end up being an invasive either. So there's a lack of knowledge, just not knowing what's going on. The second one I think is a lesser reason, but it's growing as more and more people hear the term invasive and we get more education about invasives out, is that it's a lack of understanding. And so with that, I mean that people plant these plants knowing that they're invasive or hearing the term invasive and understanding that, but not really grasping the full realization of how big this problem is. What's the scope of the problem, how threatening, how damaging invasive species are, and then how their actions can contribute to that problem. So they understand that, yeah, bush honeysuckle's bad, but I really like that plant. It's really pretty, or I really want a privet hedge, and so I'm going to plant it, without understanding that there's a lot of negative consequences that are outside of even their land, the impacts to neighboring lands or impact to the whole landscape. So largely those two, I think, are the main reasons why landowners do this. But I think the good news is that both of those can be overcome or reduced with better education. And so us as natural resource managers, invasive species people, we really need to step up, education, public education, so we can reduce those reasons for using invasives. The last one's a little more interesting, in a sense that it's, I think some are planted, not a lot, but some invasive plants are planted simply through a case of mistaken identity. The plants they bought and planted were not actually what they thought they were. They were mislabeled, they were misidentified, and they simply didn't know what they were getting, thought they were getting something different. I think this is a little more common than we think. And one great example is some research that came out a couple years ago from the Illinois Natural History Survey. In 2015, Illinois banned the sale and trade and transport of Oriental bittersweet. And so after that, there was some researchers from the History Survey that really wanted to look at American bittersweet, which is our native, that's for sale. It became popular it is popular as an ornamental plant. A lot of people want it because they want to plant natives. They still like the bittersweet idea. So they wanted to look at what are all these American bittersweets being sold. Are they actually American bittersweet? Are they hybrids, or are they Oriental bittersweet? So they bought a bunch of plants either in person, at local places, at chains, or online at stores, and then tested them genetically to figure out which ones were actually American bittersweet, which ones were Oriental bittersweet. And what they ended up finding was, more often than not, I don't have the numbers in front of me right now, but more often than not, it ended up what the plant they were buying as American bittersweet was in actuality straight Oriental bittersweet. Wasn't even the hybrid, but it was Oriental bittersweet mislabeled as American bittersweet. And so this one is this is tough to take, right? Because think about, we always promote planting natives. There's people trying to do the right thing, get a native plant, put it out on the landscape, and when they do, unbeknownst to them, they're actually planting one of the worst invaders that we have in this area. So this is something that we definitely want to stop. Definitely want to reduce this amount of mislabeling as well, but it's a tough one to take. One of the things we've done with University of Illinois Extension is we try to put out some information about how to tell the two apart as your plants age and they start flowering or fruiting. Kind of how can you make sure that you've got native bittersweet versus the Oriental bittersweet. There's a lot of other people that have information like this out as well. The problem, of course, is when they're young and the seedlings, they're much harder to tell apart. Anyway, so that's the reasons why I think some people are using these invasives. What I wanted to do is just briefly hit up on a few ornamental invasive species that are still out there on the landscape. Butterfly bush is one that we're seeing spread all over the place, kind of across the continent now, moving around as an invader. I know in my neck of the woods, we're seeing it more and more. Amber or Japanese cork tree is another one that's kind of a new invasive, I would say. We're seeing it spread quite a bit. This one, the area that I'm seeing it move into a lot here in Illinois is as areas that have had previous canopy damage due to ice storms or wind events. Cork tree seems to be able to move into that kind of that niche of that disturbed canopy, that highlight environment. We're seeing it move around quite a bit. Interestingly enough, this one is, it's has male and female plants. So people say, well, just plant the male plants, but there has been some evidence that male plants, upon occasion, will throw some fruit as well. It'll have a branch or something that'll produce some female fruit as well. So even just a straight male plant of cork tree doesn't seem to be, 100% safe. Winter creeper's another ornamental that you see some. It's really, it's kind of an old plant. It's been used a lot around, but we're seeing it spread kind of slowly off from original plantings, but when it is established, it's really hard to get rid of in these areas. So just some examples of kind of invasive ornamental species that are still found in the trade. What I really wanted to do is spend a little more time on these three, which I consider kind of the big three in the eastern US as ornamental invaders. I won't spend a lot of time on calla pear because NAISMA has a whole entire webinar coming up just about calla pear soon. So I definitely encourage you all to attend that as well. But calla pear, wing burning bush, and Japanese barberry are the three probably most popular ornamental plants that also are well-established, well-known invaders. So it's just why I wanted to spend some time on those. And calla pear, it's a good one to talk about right now because it's flowering across much of its range now. You may know it better as Bradford pear or Cleveland pear or any number of these other ornamental varieties. Deciduous small tree, extremely widely planted as an ornamental. We know it has little wildlife value and it's really widely escaped and showing a lot of invasive behavior kind of across the landscape where it's planted. This is one that's interesting in a sense that the escapes look quite a bit different than the ornamental cultivars. And if everybody knows the calla pear has that kind of teardrop shape and the big dark green leaves. And when it escapes, it often becomes multi-stemmed, almost shrubby. It regains thorns, has smaller leaves. It really looks quite a bit different. Right now is a great time to see it in Illinois because it's in full flower. You can just drive down the road and you see all these white flowering trees and you're looking at calla pear. And just a shot here from EdMaps showing where it's been found in Illinois. And actually this is probably still needs to be updated. I am confident in saying that it's found in every county in the state escaped right now. So very, very fast spread, one of the newest invasive plants around, but also still a very popular ornamental plant. And then, we're going to talk a lot about this at the next webinar, but this plant was considered sterile, at some point in time, or was considered safe. But really, it was because it was an obligate outcrosser. It couldn't self-fertilize. All the varieties, all the single variety is asexually propagated, so they're incompatible. But then when all these new varieties started being developed and people started planting in newer varieties with the older varieties, that's when we started seeing these escape populations. Burning bush is another one that we see around. It's been around forever as an ornamental plant. Everybody seems to have it in their yards, in their flower gardens, along their walkways, things like that. It's widely used as an ornamental, but it does have heavy seed producer. Many of the cultivars are, and it does tend to spread. So this is when you hear a lot of people talk about, oh, mine never spreads. I see it in my yard, but I never see little ones coming up. Maybe not realizing that the birds are picking it up and moving it into natural areas, away from it. This is one that is becoming prohibited in quite a few states now, as we're recognizing that it's a problem. Beautiful plant, a really gorgeous plant. But in that top left picture there, you can see that kind of red hue on the whole underneath the plants. Those are all seedlings, just loading in there, coming in. So this is often a heavy seed producer. This one, the land that I manage as part of my work here in Southern Illinois, this is one of our #1 issues. We have, in some areas, as big of a problem with burning bush as we have with bush honeysuckle, with multiflora rose, or anything else. So it's quite surprising. Again, out into the landscape, into the wilds, you can see this really a heavy seed producer and produces a ton of plants and can spread pretty quickly. This one's interesting in that I'm sure it's further widespread in Illinois than our data here shows. It kind of has a cluster in Southern Illinois and a big cluster in Northern Illinois. It's probably just due to the fact that we don't have a good reporting elsewhere. But anywhere there's woods, I would say in the Eastern US and the Midwest, this is one that's becoming a bigger and bigger problem. And then the last of these kind of 3 big ornamental plants that we're seeing around is Japanese barberry. This is one, again, very widely spread, prohibited in some areas. There's a lot of different cultivars, whether they're tall, small, columnar, round, different colors. They all tend, after they escape, to revert back to the kind of the traditional wild type, and can really spread, right, and really form big infestations. This is one that we didn't think we had a lot of in Illinois until we started analyzing some data from our natural areas that was taken over the last few years. And this one kept showing up again and again as an invader in even high quality natural areas. And so it became that we started to realize that it's a bigger issue than we thought in the state, and especially in our nicer areas. And so we think that it poses a threat to a lot of our rare plants and to our high quality habitats. So just kind of wrapping up then, this is a problem. I think we can all recognize it's a problem, but what can landowners do about this? And just kind of in short, I think landowners, we as natural resource professionals need to encourage landowners to explore other options for planting than these, whether they're non-native or non-invasive alternatives, as long as they're not invasive. All of us need to notice the species are escaping, readily reproducing, get that information out through groups like EdMaps, consider replacing existing plantings of invasive species, and then just keep up to date on the invasive species listing and invasive species introductions. Here in Illinois, our invasive species listing, our regulations are the Illinois Exotic Weed Act. We have several different laws, but this is the main one for kind of terrestrial and invasive species. It's a good law. It's really well written, but for a long time it was didn't have a big list. It was just the buckthorns, purple loosestrife kudzu, Japanese honeysuckle, and multiflora rose, and that was it. And then we worked really closely with the Illinois green industry, which is the horticultural industry here in the state, really to assess a lot of plants and come to kind of some consensus and update this this list in 2015. And so at that time, we added a lot of species that were kind of low-hanging fruit and put them on our list, which was great to see. But it was really a combination of natural resource professionals working hand in hand with green industry professionals to kind of to come to some agreement to start this process. And we're hopefully keeping this going and kind of keep adding new species. And I know a lot of other states are doing the same thing, and that's a great direction that we need to do. And then just kind of lastly, a list here of what to do. What should we do as natural resource professionals? I think one of the big lists we should do, or one of the things we need to do, is use and promote native or non-invasive alternatives. And I really like to highlight native in that case. Things that people can plant instead of invasives. So our message isn't just don't do this, don't do this. We have an alternative. We have something else they can do. And there's great examples out there of native gardenings out there as in visitor centers, welcome centers. I just had to throw in a picture of my native garden here in my yard. It's been a wonderful thing to do over the last 5 or 6 years, and it really has reduced our mowing, and it's a great thing to promote, and so I really enjoy it as well. One great way to promote this is this book. If you've never read Bringing Nature Home by Doug Tallamy, I really recommend it. It talks a lot about why we need to use native plants as landscaping trees and landscaping plants. What are the wildlife benefits to going native as opposed to even ornamental, non-invasive, non-natives. So it's a great book to read. I like to highlight natives. I really like using them. We have a ton of native species out there that are wonderful, can be used as great ornamentals. In Illinois, we have every color of the rainbow of native wildflowers out there. So it's great to promote them and use them when we can. Other things that we can do, of course, is control invasive plants. And I think that's one thing that we all do here that are involved with NAISMA. I do like this quote from the Nature Conservancy. Their Global Invasive Species Initiative website has a statement that we control invasive species because they're harming the native plants and native animals we care so much about protecting. I really like that quote. I think it really summarizes that why we're dealing with invasive species. It's not because they're not native. It's not because they're not a natural part of the system. It's because they're doing damage, and that's why we don't like them there. So I think it's a good summary. Go right along with that, I think we can make sure that we learn more about our native ecosystems, our native plants, and we get that information out to the public as well. There's tons of guides, tons of information, good websites out there about that in every state or province that you can find groups like native plant societies to be involved in. And then finally, we can spread the word and not the weeds. And that's just highlighting, we can do education, talking about this issue, trying to drive demand for these ornamental invasive plants down, trying to increase assessments and regulations, really becoming in this kind of education outreach is really important. And there's good groups out there doing stuff like the Woody Invasives of the Great Lakes Collaborative here in the Midwest that really with a focus on woody ornamental invasives. There's lots of funny slogans and information out there and educational things out there. And then I'll end with back in 2002, a bunch of experts got together at the Missouri Botanical Gardens and developed a kind of voluntary codes of conduct out there that really apply to green industry, natural resource managers, and everybody looking at how do we deal with this issue of ornamental invasives. And I think they're good. It's a good start for sure out there, and it kind of highlights this is a bigger problem than just ornamentals industry, a bigger problem than just natural resource industry, bigger problem than public lands or just private lands. And the biggest takeaway from those voluntary codes of conduct in those meetings are that we need to do this as a collaborative effort and work together. And I think that's the kind of the biggest take-home message that I want to give out and for this webinar is this is a big issue. It's pretty complex, but working with industry, working with landowners, working with natural resource professionals is the way to address it. And with that, I'll leave you all with my contact information. and I was able to actually leave some time for questions. So I'm happy to take questions and yeah, whatever else anybody wants to talk about.
Fantastic, Chris. Thank you so much for this really excellent webinar. We do have a lot of questions. We won't be able to get through all of them, so I'll try to pick and choose some right now, and then we'll send you the rest that you can follow up with people individually.
Okay.
Okay, so Gary Fish asks, why haven't more states banned the sale of invasive plants?
That's a good question. It is, and I think that some of them have, and I think it's a growing thing. So yeah, not all states have, and I think they're all behind. But it comes down to a balance, right? Anytime that you regulate an ornamental invasive, you're also removing it from an industry that it's making money from that plant and utilizing that plant. So there's a need to be very sure about things, a need to do it in a way that you're not damaging damaging an industry. And those industries do have a lot of clout as well. I mean, they're big industries in different states. So I think for a while it was kind of hands off because of that. But I think now, if you look at the trend over the last 10 years or so, you're seeing a lot of these states updating their invasive species list, adding regulations. So I think it's a trend that's happening more and more now as regulations are becoming more of a regular thing. And I think because they're doing them hand in hand with the green industry.
Thanks, Chris. Another question here is, do we have records of previously successful management of invasive ornamentals, or are there invasive species management techniques that Native American communities might have practiced, which can guide management going forward?
That's a good question too. We have success stories out there, right? So we have areas, local success stories where there's invasives, ornamental invasives or other invasives that came into an area and we're able to exclude them to a certain degree and maintain, thriving native ecosystems in there. I think I don't know if there's any kind of historical management recommendations, from Native Americans. Largely a lot of these invasives weren't really recognized as an issue or weren't even recognized as a need to manage them kind of really until the mid-century, mid last century in the 1950s, 1960s, I think is really when we started seeing plants as an issue outside of agriculture, outside of just agricultural weeds. We do have a lot of good management recommendations that have been developed over those, the last 70, 80 years on some of these, and it's continually evolving. That's one of the major avenues with science right now. Weed science, invasive species science is finding the best, safest, most effective means of managing these plants.
Great. And Hans Lindell suggests or asks, do you know about plantright.org in California, a great voluntary program to remove invasive ornamentals from the nursery trade?
Yes, yeah, there's some great, that's a really good one right there. There's several really good examples of initiatives and efforts kind of across the whole North America to do, to address ornamental invasives. And I know just recently South Carolina had a buyback program kind of thing for collar repair. I would love to highlight a bunch of those, but I didn't take time to put them in here, but that's a really good one, yes.
Excellent. John Wideness asks, what approaches can be done neighbor to neighbor in educating and convincing our neighbors that they should get rid of their invasive plants and avoid purchasing other invasives?
That's a fantastic question. And I think that's probably one of the most impactful things we can do. If you look at conservation on private lands, most of that is done kind of with across the fence conversations, landowner to landowner. So I think that's probably the most needed thing we can do. What I've seen is it's experience, firsthand experience, or seeing kind of the proof on the ground. One landowner telling another, showing them it's a problem, going on their land and showing that plant escaping, doing it in a non-accusatory way, I think is important as well. But just building those relationships. And again, like I mentioned earlier, don't just focus on the don't say, don't plant this, you need to kill that, you need to get rid of this. but highlight the benefits of native species, highlight the benefits of putting native species as ornamentals, or to managing your forest, or to managing your land, and all the wildlife benefits. Focus on the good side of things and how things can be improved by the nice things. And so that way it's not like you're condemning them or accusing them of doing something bad. I think it's important.
Yep, excellent question and great points, Chris. Um, we'll move on to Dia Lorenz, who asks, can you describe the listing process for noxious weeds in Illinois? Do you petition? Is there consensus building?
That's a good question. So there's a couple different regulations in the state. There's a noxious weed list, which is really agricultural based. The one that I think is most relevant to this talk is our Illinois exotic weed list. And the exotic weed list is our terrestrial invasive plant, regulated terrestrial invasive plant list. It actually in the state can only be updated through a legislative action. So what we did to update it actually was get together as a group through the Invasive Plant Species Council in partnership with the green industry, and we assessed a bunch of plants. And so we had an assessment form that we developed that kind of critically looked at plants' characteristics, its known invasiveness in other areas, its current spread in the state, its value to as an ornamental plant, and value to the horticulture industry, and kind of put all of that in a document. And then we met as a group and basically worked to come to consensus on what we should do about those plants. Some plants, the decision was made that they didn't deserve or didn't warrant regulating at that point. There wasn't enough information, or it didn't become an invasive. Others, it warranted regulation. And then the kind of third category was it was somewhere in between, where it was a known invader, but it was still very important to the ornamental industry, horticulture industry, or it was there wasn't enough information in there, so we kind of left that one in limbo. But basically, that process came out with recommendations for legislation, and then we had some nonprofit partners that took up those recommendations and then brought them to lawmakers to introduce it. And so that's kind of the process we had in our state. It's a bit cumbersome, but it was consensus building kind of among the major players. And I think the really way that we got it through and got it done was because we had the support and the involvement of the green industry from the start.
And I guess just to add to that, I think that's how, of the other states that I know of, that's very similar to the strategy in other states. For example, Wisconsin, I know had the similar process. All right, we have a couple more minutes for questions. Catherine Baird asks, is there any central reference or database of invasive plant species and mapping where certain species are invasive across North America?
Yeah, I would think that the best example of that would be EDMAPS. So EDMAPS is early detection and distribution mapping system. It's out of the University of Georgia. So it's kind of a central location that consolidates distribution information for all the different invasive species, plants, and other organisms, and then maps them. But the other thing it does, and I think it's just as important, is it consolidates listing. So you can go and look at a plant and it'll show you there which states have it listed as an invasive, which states have it regulated, what other entities, whether it's Park Service or Native Plant Societies, different groups like that, or EPSIs, listed as an invasive. So it's a way to kind of see across the board who considers this plant invasive, at the same time as seeing on a map kind of where it's being found. And there's some other examples of that, but that's probably the most complete one, for the whole continent for sure.
And just to add to that, the Center for Ecosystem Health and Invasive Species out of University of Georgia that does the EDMAPS has a fantastic, I mean, probably the most comprehensive database of pictures, if that's what you're looking for, lists. It's a very easy to use searchable database of images, not just plants, but also aquatic and other pests.
And I think, Belle, if I'm not mistaken, NAISMA will have a webinar on that coming up as part of this April webinar series, right?
That is correct. I'm not remembering exactly which date. It's going to be either 3 weeks. I believe that I think it's the third week in April, not the 15th, but the one after that. Yeah, good point. Okay, we got time for one more question. Maria Winkler asks, in Illinois, how are you able to practice EDRR for incoming invasives if it takes a legislative act to update your list?
That's a good question. And so, EDRR is broader than just regulations. So with an ornamental plant coming in, our list kind of regulates ornamental plants or regulates plants from being sold or transported. That aspect is a little slower, and known invaders or problem invaders, they come in from a bunch of different ways. We still have the ability to kind of rapidly work with like other invasive species, or even some of these invaders that aren't regulated. If they show up on the ground and we find new infestations, we can control them or work with the landowners and the agencies to control them, even without having that having them on the regulated list. The other thing we do is we do try to kind of work ahead of time for what we expect to be coming in and kind of develop plans. A great example of that in Illinois is before we ever had hydrilla, which is a major aquatic invasive, we developed a task force, we developed a response plan, an EDR plan. So we had that in place with everything ready to roll basically before hydrilla ever showed up. So when it did show up last year, we could immediately kind of come in and react to that and respond to that infestation. So some of that is kind of working ahead for the ones that we have a pretty good idea that we're going to see in the near future.
Perfect. All right. Well, with that, we're going to wrap up, and I'm going to switch screens just to point out to everyone listening today. First, I want to thank everyone for joining us. We had a record attendance today. Thank you all for taking time out of your days to join us. Thanks, Chris, again, for this excellent webinar. Any unanswered questions, again, as I've mentioned before, we'll send them to Chris, and he will do his best to answer those questions. And you have his contact information now as well. You're welcome to reach out. This, I wanted to point out, is NAISMA's special April webinar series that we put together, knowing that a lot of people are not able to do their regular jobs in the current situation that we're all struggling with throughout the world. And so if you are not a member, this is a great time to join. Check out our membership page here. If you're an organization, we have additional membership plans for organizations. We rely on the support of our members to organize these webinar series, and we thank you so much for your support for those who are members. And I wanted to point out one more thing. Some of you may have heard about this webinar through Play Clean Go, which is our outreach, prevention and awareness campaign targeted at outdoor recreationists. This is the website there, and I want to give a little plug for Play Clean Go Awareness Week that will come up in the second week of June, so stay tuned for more information about that. And with that, we will stop the recording. Thank you again for joining us, and thanks again, Chris. We hope to see you again next week at the next special April webinar. So have a great rest of the day and week.